Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is S.C. Coleman, author. In this video, we are going to be talking about the academic angle to the root server system. In my previous videos, I did briefly mention some documents about the root server system which had academic tags on them, if you will, such as the name of Harvard. The rest of these don't really have the banner or the letterhead of a university or whatnot, but they're very clearly coming from a academia source, academicians. That's the type of perspective is here. Now you can divide those two things up as academic and attorney. With the attorneys, there's this sort of strange sanctity of law enforcement and religion based off of quote unquote the law, which is nonsensical, emotional, and it has nothing to do with any sort of logical or rational explanation or argument, but rather the feeling of that you're supposed to do what is quote unquote right. That's the attorney perspective. The academic perspective is a little bit more haughty. They both are arrogant and haughty, but the academic perspective is, it talks with flowery words but says nothing, and is constantly expecting something, right? They always have certain expectations. That's the academic viewpoint. Both obviously have their nose turned up towards the sky. To use a Czech phrase, their nose cuts the clouds, meaning they're looking down at you over their nose, that type of thing. So this first one is appears to be a response to a survey, the Root Server System 2025 Technical Diversity Report. An important security aspect of the RSS is technical and operational diversity. This helps reduce the impacts of a critical failure of individual software, hardware, or operational components by eliminating single points of failure. The Root Server System Advisory Committee, RSSAC, has published a document named RSSAC 001 entitled Service Expectations of Root Servers Operators, which places clear expectations on the root server operators, RSOs. One such expectation from RSSAC 001 V2 is for the RSOs to collectively publish aggregated implementation diversity reports from time to time. This document addresses that expectation by describing the collective diversity of the RSS. The categories of diversity described here are based on the recommendations on RSSAC 001B2. As a starting point, the RSOs conducted a detailed survey, of RSS diversity and collectively analyzed the results. Information present here is a result of that analysis, and it has been aggregated across all RSOs with no attempt to convey the relative distribution of each technology. Also note that RSOs often leverage diversity within their own operations, e.g. multiple operating systems, multiple hardware platforms, which is not necessarily reflected in this aggregate view. Operating system software. The following variety of operating systems are in use by the RSOs: FreeBSD, Linux, and NetBSD. Furthermore, the following variety of Linux distributions are in use: Alma Linux, CentOS, Debian, Oracle Linux, RHEL, Rocky Linux, and Ubuntu. Following variety of name server software products are in use: Atlas, Bind, NotDNS, and NSD. Routing hardware and software, we've got Arista, Bird, Cisco, FRR, Juniper, OpenBGP, and Quagga. Virtualization, you've got KVM, Proxmox, VMware. Server hardware, Dell, Fujitsu, generic Intel, AMD, Hewlett-Packard, IX Systems, and Supermicro. Regional Internet Registry, APNIC, ARIN, LOCKNIC, RIPE NCC. you have for deployment automation Ansible, Jenkins, Puppet, and Salt. Organization types include exchange point provider, government agency, network service provider, nonprofit, regional internet registry, registry operator, and university. Now, in the next document, I'm going to explain the connection between university and government agency. And even though it doesn't directly stipulate this type of activity, it is very clear that this type of activity is relative to that document or relating to it. So this next document that we're going to look at is called Model Agreement Memorandum of Understanding between the Department of General Services, University of California, and the California State University. University of California and California State University receive approximately $6 billion from the State General Fund each year. State agencies and departments entered into more than 2,500 contracts or contract amendments with the University of California and the California State University. In many cases, the state pays for both sides of the contract negotiations. The state and the universities would establish standardized provisions that would apply to all contracts. The Department of General Services shall negotiate and establish a model contract with standard contract provisions with the University of California and with the California State University. Standard provisions shall be used in contracts entered into between the University of California and the California State University and state. Representatives of the Department of General Services, other state agencies and departments, the University of California, and the California State University have met typically monthly since January 2010 to negotiate the model contract. Effective on January 1st, 2016, the Department of General Services, the regents of the University of California, and the trustees of the California State University have negotiated the model terms and conditions. The model contract, UTC 116, used as a template for all agreements subject to this MOU, State University Proposal and Administration Manual, SUPAM, S-U-P-A-M, will be finalized by the parties within 2 years or other mutually agreed upon time period after execution of the MOU. Representatives from DGS, UC Office of the President of the CSU Office of the Chancellor will work together in good faith to resolve implementation issues, if any, in a timely manner as they arise. To be effective, any modifications to the model contract terms UTC 116 other than that noted in paragraph 6 above must be made in writing and executed by authorized representatives of the parties. This MOU constitutes the entire contract. Notice, of course, the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, is here being referenced as a, quote, entire contract, and understanding between the parties with respect to subject matter of this MOU and supersedes any previous or contemporaneous writing or oral representation, statements, negotiations, or contracts. Now here's the cover identities. David Zocchetti, Deputy Director-in-Chief, Counsel, Office of Legal Services, Department of General Services. Sue DeRosa, Director of Sponsored Programs, Trustees of the California State University, and Wendy Straits, Executive Director, Research Policy Analysis and Coordination, the Regents of the University of California. Sort of a typical type of thing. Now here we have the signatures, dated 2015. David Zocchetti, attorney, signed 10/27/2015. Sue DeRosa, Director of Sponsored Programs, 11/2/2015, and Wendy Straits is 10/30/2015 for the Regents of the University of California. Attachment 1, CSU Campus Auxiliary Organizations authorized to accept and administer grants and contracts on behalf of the university. Now, the majority of these are, unsurprisingly, they're foundations and other universities, etc. Some of the weird ones that pop out first is the University Corporation at Monterey Bay, the Cal Poly Pomona Foundation Incorporated, University Enterprises Incorporated, which lists here as CSU Sacramento, University Enterprises Corporation at CSU SB, CSU San Bernardino, Cal Poly Corporation, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and University Auxiliary Research Services Corporation, CSU San Marcos. The contracted CSU auxiliary organization shall defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the state, its officers, employees, and agents from and against any and all liability, loss, expense, attorney fees, or claims for injury or damages arising out of the performance of this agreement, but only in proportion to and to the extent such liability, loss, expense, attorney's fees, or claims for injury or damages are caused by or result from the negligent or intentional acts or omissions of the auxiliary, its respective officers, agents, or employees. If the university provides funds to any third party subawardee, excluding any agency or department of the United States, to accomplish any of the work in this agreement, the university shall first enter a written agreement with each subawardee, by which the subawardee agrees to indemnify and hold harmless and blah blah blah. That's a really weird word that they're using. Rather than saying subcontractor, they're calling it a subawardee. Now what I believe is that the term subcontractor will also be used with the addition of the term subawardee to a different entity, so it's hard to say. We have to really get into this paperwork to find out. Here we have the State of California Standard Agreement, STD, right? I think everybody automatically would think STD is a reference to the sexually transmitted disease, but here of course it means standard or state. I don't know. I assume it would be standard, but STD for standard, maybe. Anyway, 213, STD 213, that's Sierra Tango Delta 213, Rev 0603. You've got agreement number, registration number, just, the usual type of form you would expect there. Exhibit A, we've got scope of work. If third-party confidential information is to be provided to the state. Schedule of deliverables, list all items that will be delivered to the state under the proposed scope of work, including all reports, including draft reports from state review and other deliverables if requested by the state and agreed to by the parties. If use any deliverables restricted or anticipated contain pre-existing data or copyrightable works, with any restricted use will be clearly identified in Exhibit A4, use of pre-existing data, copyrighted works, and deliverables. Next, we've got Exhibit A2, key personnel. List key personnel as defined in the agreement, stating with the PI last name, first name followed by COPIs. Then list all other key personnel in alphabetical order by last name. For each individual listed, include his/her name, institutional affiliation, role on the proposed project. Use additional consecutively numbered pages as necessary. Authorized representatives and notices. The following individuals are the authorized representatives for the state and the university under this agreement. Any official notices issued under the state terms of this agreement shall be addressed to the authorized official identified below unless otherwise identified in the agreement. Changes in the university principal and investigator subject to key personnel section of this agreement. Changes in other contract information may be made by notification in writing between the parties. The university contacts, of course, includes first the principal investigator, which I believe is an interesting title they have elected. See, academicians love to give themselves lofty titles, and in the end they usually mean nothing. The attorneys love to make cat's paw lofty titles for fake individuals who don't exist. Meanwhile, they occupy the quote-unquote administrative sections and often take up a position as interim or assistant or acting or deputy so-and-so. Now, we have a financial contact for the state, which is listed as accounting, but the authorized financial contact for the university is listed as invoicing. It's an interesting thing to notice there. Exhibit A4, use of pre-existing data, copyrighted works, and deliverables. State pre-existing data and or copyrighted works may be provided to the university from state or a third party for its use in the performance of the scope of work. Anticipated restrictions on use of project data. If the university PI anticipates that any of the project data generated during the performance of the scope of work will have a restriction on use, such as subject identifying information in a data set, then list all such anticipated restrictions below. If there are no restrictions anticipated in the project data, then check none in this section. Curriculum vitae, CV, resumes, biosketch. for Exhibit A5. But it does say that you attach CV, resume, biosketch for key personnel listed in Exhibit A2. Exhibit A7, third-party confidential information agreement or confidential non-disclosure agreement. If the scope of work requires the provisions of third-party confidential information to the state or the universities, then any requirement of the third party in the use and disposition of the confidential information will be listed below. The third party may require a separate confidential non-disclosure agreement, CNDA, as a requirement to use the confidential information, and any CNDA will be identified in Exhibit A7. Then we have Exhibit B, budget estimate for project period. And next we have Exhibit B1, budget justification. And down here we have the subawardee consortium subrecipient cost. Each participating consortium organization must submit a separate detailed budget for every year in the project period in Exhibit B2, subcontracts including complete justification for the need for any subawardee listed in the application. Then we have Exhibit B2, budget estimates pertaining to subcontractors. So I wonder why they chose to use the word subawardee as well as the word subcontractor. We have, in accordance with Section 14, payment and invoicing, the invoice, summary report, and a transaction and payroll ledger shall be certified by the university's financial contact and the PI. Summary invoice, subawardee consultants and subawardee subcontracts / subrecipients. So I guess they're using subawardee as consultants, subcontracts, and subrecipients. Then we have a GL account and object code. Exhibit C, UTC 116, AB 20 / University Model Agreement Terms and Conditions can be found at http www.dgs.cal.gov or .ca.gov /OLS /resources /standard contract language.aspx. Next we have Exhibit D, prime agreement number, federal CFDA number. If the agreement is subject to any additional requirements imposed on the funding state agency by applicable law, including but not limited to bond proposition and federal funding, then these additional requirements will be set forth in Exhibit D. If the university is a subrecipient as defined in blah blah blah. You know, Exhibit E, if applicable special conditions for security of confidential information. If the work or project results in additional legal and regulatory requirements regarding security of confidential information, those requirements regarding the use and disposition of the information will be provided by the funding state agency in Exhibit E. Exhibit F, access to state facilities or computer systems, agency requirements agreement. And the scope of work or project requires the university to have access to state agency facilities or computer systems, and a separate agreement between the individuals accessing the facility or system and the state agency is necessary. Then the requirement of the agreement and the agreement itself will be listed in Exhibit F. Negotiated alternate UTC terms if applicable. With every effort has been made to keep the UTC as universal in its application as possible. There may be unique projects where a given term in the UTC may be inappropriate or inadequate. AB 20 allows for those terms to be changed. Isn't that interesting? So that they can turn it into a quote-unquote living document. That's what they mean when they say living document. They mean constantly revising and changing and updating it, and of course making sure that it's never quote-unquote outdated. No oral understanding or agreement not incorporated in the agreement is binding on any of the parties. That's an old concept, which is where we get a term legal from, meaning reduced to writing. And it's something that the equity courts specifically say is that they cannot even admit something that's based off, that's not in writing. And that's the reason why you always have to give a police statement in writing. You have to do everything in writing because it's all done by the equity court. That's how equity courts work. Others can do things based off of oral presentations and whatnot alone. Liability. The university shall defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the state's officers, employees, and agents from and against all liabilities, loss, expense, attorney's fees, or blah blah blah. Usual in accordance with Government Code Section 895.4, the state shall defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the university. Okay, so here you've got for liability, nobody's liable. Right? That's what you can take away from this. No one's liable whatsoever at all. There's no reason to read through all these long paragraphs when they're all basically saying the same thing, and each entity says, we're going to hold you liable, and then the other entity comes back and says, we'll hold you liable, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, all this paperwork is being written by the same people, and they're just basically running their little shell corporations, which of course includes the state of California, the universities, and then all the other subset entities. If the university provides funds to any third party, subordinate, excluding any agency or department of the United States to accomplish any of the work with the agreement, the university shall first enter into a written agreement with each subordinate by which the subordinate agrees to indemnify and hold harmless the state of California, the state and its officers, agents, and employees from any and all blah blah blah, and of course to hold the university liable or not liable from etc. State intends to avoid any real or apparent conflict of interest on the part of the university, subordinate, or employees, officers, and directors of the university, or subordinate. Thus, the state reserves the right to determine in its reasonable discretion whether any information, assertion, or claim received from any sources indicates the existence of real or apparent conflict of interest. Yeah, that's all just a bunch of bullcrap. Their conflict of interest is, of course, not the same conflict of interest that most of us would believe a conflict of interest to be. If either party becomes aware of a known or suspected conflict of interest pursuant to blah 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 within 20 calendar days from the date of notification of the conflict, the university will provide additional information sufficient to fully evaluate the nature and effects of the potential conflict. The state may, at its discretion, upon receipt of a written request from the university, authorize an extension of the timeline indicated herein. So basically, if they do find a conflict of interest, or if there's a report of a conflict of interest, then they'll just extend and extend and search and extend. Now, the state's contracts for such program manager or the university principal investigator shall attempt to informally resolve any disputes under this agreement. Pending the final resolution of any dispute arising under this agreement, the university agrees to diligently proceed with the performance of the agreement, including delivery of goods or the provision of services or research in accordance with the terms of this agreement, unless the dispute involves the university's continued performance under this agreement. The university's failure to diligently proceed in accordance with the state's instructions shall be considered a material breach of the agreement. The state agrees to continue payment for costs not under dispute. If payment for services performed by a university is part of the dispute, to the extent it is legally able to do so, the state will ensure that funds remain available for this purpose and do not revert prior to the conclusion of the dispute resolution process. So above all else, they must, regardless of anything, they must and absolutely must continue doing whatever. It's not detailed what exactly they're supposed to be doing. Good cause is defined as a possibility of performance or frustration of purpose. Good cause does not include material breach or termination for convenience. If either party notifies the other of a material breach, the breaching party will have 15 calendar days to respond with a remedy. To correct the breach, the receiving party has 15 calendar days to accept or reject the proposed remedy or offer an alternative remedy. Upon approval of the proposed remedy, the breaching party has 30 calendar days to implement the cure. In the event of the breaching party does not cure the breach within the 30-day period, what a weird way to talk, the non-breaching party may terminate for cause immediately upon written notice. All notifications, acceptances, and or rejections must be submitted in writing. Next page. Information or data that personally identifies an individual or individuals shall be protected. In safeguarding all such information or data which comes into their possession under this agreement in perpetuity, and shall not release or publish any such information. In perpetuity means forever. Now this appears to be foreign. Third parties may provide confidential information to the state or directly to the university for use by the university in the performance of the scope of work. Any such information will be defined in the state, and the scope of work is third-party confidential information. In addition, such third party may also request a separate confidential non-disclosure agreement. If applicable, a CNDA for this purpose will be provided as Exhibit A7. Nothing in here directly stipulates that it's foreign, but nothing in here stipulates that it can't be a foreign entity that's being protected for quote-unquote confidential information. At the end of the said 5-year period, or upon request from the state, university will return or destroy confidential information. The receiving party will take all appropriate measures to protect the confidentiality of such information while it's in possession. Isn't all that stuff interesting? That's like what you would expect an intelligence agency to be involved in and have information that requires that level of quote unquote discretion, if you will, but really it's just secrecy and hiding, and I'm just being kind of a weasel. Any change in the key personnel identified in Exhibit A2 scope of work shall require prior approval of the state. The state shall not unreasonably delay its determination whether to provide such approval. And of course, we can use a phrase that they love to use all the time, which is, if you're not doing anything bad, then you have nothing to hide. Of course, they obviously are doing something bad because they have a lot to hide, don't they? The university will provide any documentation required to facilitate the state determination of whether or not to approve the proposed change in key personnel. That's called an access roster. The university shall be responsible, well, it's called by some an access roster, I should say. Not in all regards is it called an access roster. The university shall be responsible for establishing and maintaining written agreements with and making payments to subawardees for work performed in accordance with the terms of this agreement. Nothing contained in this agreement or any subsequent amendment to this agreement shall create any contractual relationship between the state and any subawardee. No subawardee shall relieve the university of its responsibilities and obligations hereunder. The university shall provide copies of subawardee documents or subaward documents upon request by the state. So they are laundering the activities as well as the money and information. This section shall not apply to sub-agreements with the United States Department of Energy National Laboratories. Following changes require prior approval of the state contract project manager whether or not the change has a budgetary impact. Inclusion of restricted use or data, copyrighted works and deliverables, computer or theft-sensitive equipment not included in the approved budget. And I guarantee all of this has quite a lot to do with the root server zone or system, which I expect is one of the major reasons for the university's requirement for so much land, is because the universities themselves act as the root zone, and the data servers in the universities appear to be the root zone, to operate and function in the root zone. And logically it is correct too, considering the large number of enormous universities around the globe that all seem to work together in tight collusion. Invoices shall bear the university's name as shown in the agreement, including the agreement number and university fund reference number. Identifying the billing and or performance period covered by the invoice, provide a detailed transaction ledger, including payroll detail for the same period. Provide university invoice contact telephone number and or email address. Be prepared in accordance with the approved cost categories identified in Exhibit B and the elements contained in Exhibit B3. Be certified as true and correct in ink by an electronically scanned copy of a signature by the university's authorized financial contact identified in Exhibit A3, and that's of course what you would call an auto pen. Copy of the invoice detailed transaction ledger shall be certified in ink by an electronically scanned copy of the signature by the PI for cost incurred in the following statement. I have reviewed the expenditure detail for this invoice to determine the allowability of the charges to this project and certify that the salaries and wages included on this invoice and ledger are an accurate representation of an actual time worked. This certified document may be transmitted electronically to the state's contract project manager, technical, identified in Exhibit A3. The university agrees that the awarding state agency, the Department of General Services, the Bureau of State Audits, or other designated representatives shall have the right to audit and or review and copy any records and supporting documentation pertaining to performance of this agreement if it exceeds $10,000. So if it's $9,999, then that does not exceed $10,000. And if it's $10,000 itself, neither does that exceed $10,000. So therefore, no audit. And if you have a whole bunch of little tiny transactions, quote, tiny, all in the, without breaching the 10,000 level threshold, there will be no audit. Isn't that interesting? Copyrights. All rights and copyrightable works first created by the university in the performance of the scope of work, Exhibit A under this agreement, are the property of the university unless restricted under Exhibit A4. The university shall grant to the state fully paid up, royalty-free, non-exclusive, sub-licensable, irrevocable license to use, reproduce, prepare derivative works, and distribute copies of deliverables identified in Exhibit A1 to fulfill the state's government's purposes. I don't love how these people talk amongst each other like they're real people, you know, it's the state's purposes. This stuff's quite ridiculous. If the purpose of the scope of work is specifically to create a copyrightable work for use by the state, all rights in such copyrightable work will be the property of the state, subject to a reserve right for the university to use the copyrightable work for educational research purposes, to allow other educational and nonprofit institutions to do so for educational and research purposes. Upon written request and subsequent amendment, the state may request the delivery of computer software that is not identified in Exhibit A1. The university shall grant a fully paid up, royalty-free, non-exclusive, sub-licensable, irrevocable license to use, reproduce, prepare derivative works, and distribute copies to fulfill state's government purposes. If university access to state agency facilities or computing systems required, a separate agreement between the individual accessing the facility or system and the state agency may be necessary. Headings within this agreement are for convenient reference only and have no effect in limiting or extending the language of the provisions to which they refer. Force majeure. This is something you actually don't see very often in a lot of these documents. Neither party shall be liable to the other for any delay in or failure for performance, nor shall any such delay in failure of performance constitute default if such delay or failure is caused by force majeure. As used in this section, force majeure is defined as follows: acts of war and acts of God, such as earthquakes, floods, and other natural disasters, such that performance is impossible. So if it's not an act of war, or quote, act of God, that does in fact make performance impossible, then it won't be covered under the force majeure section. Isn't that interesting? Force majeure is supposed to cover everything, but in this document, they're redefining what force majeure is. That's a classic little manipulative, annoying, and stupid tactic that attorneys love to do, where they, in the paperwork, redefine a term contrary to its customary and traditional use, which you're not supposed to do. But they do it anyway because there is no real law or order going on right now. Confidential information, the disclosure of which is restricted or prohibited by any provision of law. Yeah, right. Some examples of confidential information include, but are not limited to, public social services client information. That's a big one. Public social services client information. Described in California Welfare and Institutions Code section 10850, so child trafficking, and personal information about individuals that is non-disclosable under California Civil Code, the Information Practices Act, blah, 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 or any information identified as confidential by the parties in accordance with Section 8 of this agreement. So it doesn't have to apply to the first two, it could apply just to the last one and it still works. And that's, of course, to hide all of their little nasty, collusive conspirators. Principal investigator. The principal investigator is defined as the individual judged by the university to have the appropriate level of authority and responsibility, and has been designated in the university's proposal to the state to direct the project or program supported by the agreement. And patent rights, subject to the requirements of law, all rights of patentable interventions or discoveries conceived and first actually reduced to practice in the performance of the scope of work, Exhibit A, conducted under this agreement, patentable inventions, shall belong to the university. The state shall have a non-exclusive, sub-licensable, irrevocable, paid-up license to practice or have practiced such patentable invention for government purposes. A state confirmatory license attached will be executed by the university to provide said license to any such patentable invention within 90 days after filing a patent application. So I guess this document itself is acting as Congress, considering that is the duty of Congress to do, not the state of California and the University of California together, along with all of their other idiot, nonsensical shell corporations. Subject to the requirements of law, all rights to any patentable inventions or discoveries conceived and first actually reduced or practiced in the performance of the scope of work, Exhibit A, conducted in this agreement, patentable inventions shall be assigned to the state. The university shall have non-exclusive, sub-licensable, irrevocable, and so basically it's just the same thing. Just they're both covered equally in the way that they steal property developed by other people as quote-unquote patentable or licensable or copyright or whatnot. License to the state of California for an application filed intended in countries. That's a section right there. The invention identified above is a subject invention under the patent rights. The university clause, which is included among the terms of the above identified grant contract award from the state of California, subject to the requirements of federal funds if any of this document is confirmatory of non-exclusive, sub-licensable, blah, blah, blah. And the same for the license to the university. On the other side, finally, we have the Memorandum of Understanding between the Regents of the University of California, manager and operator of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, contract number DEAC 0205CH11231. So that's contract number Delta Echo Alpha Charlie 02-05 Charlie Hotel 11231 Building and Construction Authority, Singapore Building and Construction Authority Act. Collaborative projects includes building systems integration, ventilation and indoor environment quality, computational building simulation tools, building sensors, controls and communications, data acquisition and management. Designated representatives. To administer the implementation of this MOU, each participant designates one principal coordinator through whom all requests and plans for that participant are to be made. The designated representative for LBNL is the Environmental Energy and Technologies Division, EETD Director or designated LBNL Principal Coordinator. The designated representative for BCA is the Group Director of Research at the time this MOU is signed, or other designee is appointed by the BCA from time to time. Signed 16th November 2012 for both. Deputy Laboratory Director Horst Simon, Regents of the University of California, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. John King, or Kung, K-U-N-G, makes me wonder if his first name is actually John and if that's a real person. Chief Executive Officer, Building and Construction Authority, and again, that's from Singapore. All very interesting stuff. Now, this next and last document that I was going to read, I actually don't believe I need to go through the whole document because it's not really saying anything at all. Basically, it's the threat mitigation for the root server system of August 2019 root server operators. However, the writing of this clearly is coming out of the university. Despite the fact that they use the term we a lot, it appears to have one author where all they ever talk about is how the threats are mitigated through diversity in keys. And that's the thing that we'll find a lot. It appears that their main strategy, their main focus for protection or defense is simply based off of, quote, a diversity of operations. However, operations diversity is virtually non-existent because just about everything has a pathway back to a centralized source. And all keys can be broken. Anybody who works in cryptography or decryption or those types of things knows that keys aren't secure, and neither is diversity. However, there's one thing to point out here. Listed under threat mitigation for the root server system, essentially speaking, these headlines are all about threats. We've got DOS attacks, denial of service, route hijacking, etc. But under this is listed human factors. This is the perspective a lot of these creatures, these treasonous operatives have, and that's that humanity in general is a threat. Each RSO has their own continuity of operations plan co-op with respect to personnel. The independence and diversity of co-ops among RSOs helps ensure that the entire RSS is not vulnerable to any single attack against personnel. And so that's basically the same perspective that's repeated across this whole nonsense, is that their strategy is to reduce the number of humans involved and to have, quote, diversity and keys. It's pretty ridiculous.